The cabin sat alone, a speck of weathered wood swallowed by the endless white of the Arctic tundra. Elias had chosen this isolation, driven by a hunger to understand the edges of his own mind. A neuroscientist by trade, he'd spent years studying the brain's intricate dance with the world, how it thrived on connection, withered in solitude. Now, at 42, he traded the hum of his lab for this frozen exile, a self imposed experiment to probe what happens when the human brain is starved of social contact. His only companions were a satellite link for data logs, a shelf of books, and the relentless howl of the wind. At first, the silence felt like freedom, a canvas for his thoughts too sprawl unchecked. But as days bled into weeks, the quiet began to claw at him, and his mind, his most trusted tool, started to unravel in ways he hadn't predicted. The first week was exhilarating. Elias woke each morning to the pale glow of dawn creeping through the cabin's single window, his breath visible in the frigid air. He'd sip black coffee, scribbling notes about his mental clarity, his focus sharper without the chatter of colleagues or the buzz of notifications. The brain, he knew, was a social organ, wired to mirror others' emotions, to spark and synapse in the presence of voices, glances, laughter. Without that, he hypothesized, it would lean harder on itself, perhaps unlocking hidden reserves of creativity or resilience. He ran cognitive tests, daily memory games, problem solving tasks logging, reaction times, and error rates. The data was pristine, his scores steady. He felt like a pioneer mapping uncharted territory within his own skull. At night, he'd read Dostoevsky or listen to the wind, imagining it carried whispers from the stars. He was alone, but not lonely. Not yet. By the third week, cracks began to form. The silence, once a backdrop, grew teeth. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of meaning. No one to greet, no one to argue with, no one to share the fleeting beauty of a sunrise. Elias noticed his thoughts looping, fixating on trivialities, the creak of the floorboards, the exact shade of gray in the sky. He caught himself talking aloud, narrating his tasks: boil water, check the heater, as if his voice could fill the void. His dreams grew vivid, chaotic, populated by faces from his past: his mother's smile, his ex-wife's accusing stare, a childhood friend whose name he couldn't recall. The brain, he wrote in his log, Siravi's input. Without social stimuli, it mines memory, conjuring ghosts to keep itself company. His cognitive tests showed a slight dip reaction. Time slower, errors creeping in. He brushed it off as fatigue, but a quiet unease settled in his chest, heavy as the snow piling against the cabin. Month to brought a shift he couldn't ignore. The world inside his head felt louder than the one outside. His thoughts fragmented, darting between half-formed ideas and sudden, irrational fears. What if the satellite failed? What if he forgot how to speak? He'd stare at his reflection in the window, searching for signs of himself, but the man looking back seemed foreign, gaunt, hollow-eyed, a stranger wearing his face. The brain's prefrontal cortex, he knew, regulates self-awareness, impulse control, decision-making. Social interaction keeps it sharp, like a blade on a whetstone. Without it, the edges dull. He began to second-guess his choices. Had he locked the door? Was that shadow outside a trick of the light or something else? Paranoia, he noted, is the brain's attempt to impose narrative on emptiness. He tried to counter it with routine cooking, reading, exercising, but the tasks felt hollow, like performing for an audience that wasn't there. By the fourth month, Elias was no longer just a scientist observing his mind. He was its prisoner. The loneliness wasn't an emotion anymore, it was a physical weight, pressing on his temples, tightening his throat. His brain, starved of human connection, turned inward with a vengeance. Memories he'd buried: his father's death, the divorce, a patient he'd failed to save resurfaced with brutal clarity, playing on repeat, the amygdala. That ancient alarm system was in overdrive, flooding him with cortisol, making every creak of the cabin feel like a threat. He stopped shaving, stopped caring about the tests. His logs grew erratic, sentences trailing off mid-thought. The brain rewires itself, he scrawled one night. No input, no anchor, it's eating itself alive. He began to hear voices, not distinct, but a murmur, like a crowd just beyond the walls. He knew it was auditory hallucination. The auditory cortex misfiring, desperate for sound, yet he found himself answering, pleading with the whispers to leave him alone. The sixth month broke him. Elias woke one morning to find he'd forgotten the word for spoon. He held the utensil, its shape familiar, but the name was gone, swallowed by a fog in his mind. Language, he'd once lectured, is a social construct, reinforced by use. Without others to speak to, his vocabulary was eroding, his thoughts dissolving into a soup of images and impulses. He tried to read, but the words on the page danced, meaningless. His cognitive scores were abysmal, memory tasks failed, puzzles abandoned. The brain's plasticity, its ability to adapt, was working against him, pruning neural pathways he no longer used, amplifying others in a frantic bid for survival. He felt his identity slipping like sand through his fingers. Who was he without others to reflect? Him to give him context? He wept, not for sadness, but for the sheer terror of disappearing into himself. One night, in a moment of clarity, Elias activated the satellite link and typed the final log. The brain without social contact doesn't just falter, it fractures. Mirror neurons go silent, the default mode network spins aimlessly, the limbic system screams for connection. We are not built to be alone. I am not built to be alone. He hesitated, then sent a distress signal. Days later, a helicopter's thrum broke the silence, and rescuers found him curled on the floor, muttering two shadows. They brought him back to a world of voices, faces, touch, a world his brain had nearly forgotten how to navigate. Elias spent months in recovery, relearning how to be human. Therapists spoke of neuroplasticity's double edge. The brain's ability to adapt to isolation had nearly destroyed him, but it could also rebuild. Slowly, he reconnected, first with small talk, then with deeper bonds. Each conversation, each laugh felt like a spark reigniting circuits long dormant. He published his findings, a stark warning. Social isolation doesn't just dim the brain, it dismantles it piece by piece until the self is a stranger. Yet he also wrote of hope, of the brain's hunger to heal through connection. Back in his lab, surrounded by colleagues, he felt the weight of their presence, not just as bodies, but as lifelines. The Arctic had taught him what no textbook could. We are our bonds, our shared glances, our fleeting words. Without them, the mind doesn't just wander, it vanishes.